This is our last class before Parshas BaMidbar. So we've been talking about Pirkei Avos. Before we get to it, I'd just like to make a little bit of a comment about the Parshas BaMidbar, this week's Parsha. The way our calendar works, as a rule, there's one small exception. As a rule, the Parsha before Shavuos is always Parshas BaMidbar. The one exception, we've mentioned several times, is a very unusual year where it's a leap year and Rosh Hashanah falls out on a Thursday. So in that unusual situation, there's an extra Shabbos in the winter, and an extra Parsha is read. So the Shabbos before Shavuos is not BaMidbar, rather Parshas Naso. That's an exceptional case. Interestingly, the year of the Six-Day War was that way. It was that exceptional year. The war was fought during the week before Shavuos, which was Parshas Naso. But in any case, as a rule, it's Parshas BaMidbar. The question is, we always look for some connection, some association between the Parsha and the upcoming Yom Tov. Parshas BaMidbar is a challenging Parsha in any case. You know, it's a census, numbers, arrangement of the camp, which tribe, camps on which side. At first glance, it doesn't have any lasting significance. You learn Parshas BaMidbar, you wonder why it's there at all. Certainly doesn't seem to have any connection to Shavuos. I'm going to share with you a very, very simple thought. The Ramban says that the significance of the things described in this parasha, the arrangement of the camp, which tribe camps on which side, is really carrying forward the experience of Har Sinai. When the Torah was given, so the mountain was in the middle, the Jews camped around the mountain, there was a formation, there was an array, there were barriers set up, people shouldn't come too close, and there was this tremendous experience of revelation where the Jews received the Torah. The Jews wanted that this should be something they would take with them forever. Not just the memory of it, the reliving of it. And really that's the significance of the Mishkan. When the Jews were camped in the Midbar, around the Mishkan was symbolic of Har Sinai. It was the replication of Mount Sinai. The Aron with the Luchos were at its core. It's Har Sinai. The encampment around the Mishkan is really a replication of the encampment around Har Sinai. And therefore what Parshas BaMidbar really is the taking forward of the experience of Har Sinai into the future. And if we understand it as that, then it is really the most appropriate Parsha to read by way of preparation for Shavuos. Because what are we hoping to achieve Shavuos? We're hoping that somehow the experience of Maimon Har Sinai we can take ahead, we can take forward. And that's what Parshas BaMidbar is all about. So it makes perfect sense that this is the Parsha we read before this week. Pirkei Avos, which we've been learning these weeks before Shavuos, really is comprised of only 5 chapters. The Masechta in Mishnayos, the tractate in Mishnayos, only has 5 chapters. The 6th chapter, which we're going to study this Shabbos, which we're going to start tonight, really was appended to Pirkei Avos. It's really not part of the original Pirkei Avos. And that's why its first words are Shanu Chachamim B'Lashon HaMishnah. The sages taught this chapter using the language of the Mishnah, meaning that it's in the same dialect of Hebrew, the same syntax, the same style, but it's not part of the Mishnah itself. It's modeled after the Mishnah, but it's not part of the Mishnah. It's what's called a Brisa. If you learn Gemara, you learn from Brisa. Brisa is a teaching of the sages who were contemporary with the Mishnah, but it was excluded, it was left out. The word Braisa means outside. It's not contained within the Mishnah. So this really is a Braisa. Why was it added? So the conjecture would be the following. Because the custom developed to study Pirkei Avos during the weeks between Pesach and Shavuos. The problem is there are 6 weeks, but only 5 chapters. So what are you going to do on the extra week? So they picked a Braisa, which is appropriate. Now, when we think about this a little more deeply, we'll understand why it's just this chapter of all chapters they picked. In Pirkei Avos, the first 5 chapters of Pirkei Avos really are Divrei Musar. They deal with ethical behavior. And that's a very important preliminary to Shavuos. Because Chazal tell us, Derech Eretz Kodma L'Torah. Was living as a well-mannered person, a menschlicher person, a person of good manners, that is a preliminary to Torah. First you have to be a mensch, then you can be a person who receives the Torah. Because if your life is in disarray, if your relationships are in disarray, the Torah isn't going to speak to you. First get your life together. Be a polite person, a courteous person, a well-mannered person, an efficient person, a person who is of value, and then you can make your life that much better by receiving Torah. So the first 5 chapters of Pirkei Avos deal with that aspect of preparation, Derech Eretz. And it deals with ethical, moral behavior. But to prepare us for Shavuos, we now need something extra, which is to understand exactly what Torah is. Because if we're going to receive Torah, we're going to accept Torah, we're going to commit ourselves to Torah, we should have an inkling of what Torah is all about. Its value, its worth. And therefore we have this chapter. This chapter doesn't deal with ethical behavior. This chapter deals with Torah. With the value of Torah. And therefore it's a very appropriate chapter to conclude our pre-Shavuos preparation. And that's what we're doing. So the Mishnah begins with a very interesting statement. Rabbi Meir Omer. Rabbi Meir says, Kol ha'osek b'Torah lishma. If a person engages in Torah study, lishma, for its own sake, zochel l'dvarim harbe. He merits many things. What the things are, we'll see in a few moments. Below, not only that, the creation of the entire world is worthwhile for his sake alone. The person who studies Torah for its own sake, that person is deserving of having a world created just for him. Now we're going to explain all this. But let's first talk about this idea of Torah Lishma. This is in contrast to the person who learns Torah Shelo Lishma, not for its own sake. What is the idea of learning Torah for its own sake? What does it mean to learn Torah for its own sake? As opposed to what? Because we know in life, there are things that you do as ends in themselves, and there are things that you do as means to ends. Something you do as an end in itself is lishma. It's for its own sake. It requires no further justification. Something which you do as a means to an end is shaloi lishma. It's not for its own sake, it's because it leads to something else. I'll give you an example. Let's come to you and say, no, why do you think it's important to get an education? I see you're going to school, you're studying. Why is it important to get an education? So you say, well, if I get a good education, I can get a good job. Well, why do you want a good job? Well, then I can make lots of money. Well, why do you want to make lots of money? Well, then I can buy myself a nice house and a nice car and eat well. Well, why would you want to do all those things? Because then I'll be happy. Well, why would you want to be happy? At that point, it's a silly question. Why do you want to be happy? In other words, education is a means to an end. It's a means to a job. A job is a means to making money. Making money is a means to buying nice things. buying nice things is a means to happiness. But happiness doesn't require any further justification. If someone would ask you, why do you want to be happy? You look at them like they're crazy. And why do I want to be happy? Happiness doesn't require a further justification. It's not that I want to be happy so that I'll be able to do something else. That's silly. Because every person wants to be happy. Happiness is an end in itself. But everything else is a means to an end. Let's say, for example, you have a person who's studying science. Two types of people study science. Let's say you have a person who wishes to become an engineer. He wants to design machines, or he wants to develop systems that will make people's lives better. But in order to become an engineer, you have to have grounding in pure science. He has to study physics, biology, chemistry, depending on the type of engineering he wants to do. So for him, his study of pure science is really a means to an end. Because he has to have a grounding in physics to be able to do the engineering work that he wants to do. But imagine another person who's a scientist simply because he wants to understand how the world works. So when you ask him, tell me, why do you study physics? He'll look at you and say, well, the question is that why I study physics. I study physics because I want to understand how the world works. The difference between these two is that the first is studying physics shaloi lishma, not for its own sake, only as a means to an end. The second person is studying physics lishma. And by the way, there's a very, very interesting consequence of this. There was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, Richard Feynman, a very famous person. And I once read an interview, and he was asked the following question. When you have a hypothesis, and you think that things work a certain way, and you design an experiment to test the hypothesis, and you do the experiment, you run the experiment, and you discover that you were mistaken, that the hypothesis is wrong. Are you disappointed? So he said, why should I be disappointed? He said, I do physics because I want to know how the world works. And now I know the world works in an unexpected way. I think the engineer would be upset, disappointed. Because the engineer is doing the physics because he wants to develop this machine or this system that will make people's lives happier, easier, more convenient. And he go make some money too. And it's all based on a certain hypothesis. He tests the hypothesis, it doesn't work out, so it's a dead end. So he's not going to build that machine, not develop that system, not make the money he was hoping to make. So of course it's a disappointment. But when you do something with shema, you do it for its own sake. So it's true that your inquiry may take you in an unexpected direction. That's not a disappointment. Because you wanted to know the truth. So now you know that the truth is not where you thought it would be. The truth is in a different direction. That's the difference between a person who learns something lishma and shlo lishma. And Torah can be the same thing. There's a person who learns Torah as a means to an end. Let's say, for example, a person who learns Torah and delves into Torah because he wishes to prepare lectures that will dazzle his audience and win their respect and acclaim. Okay? That's the idea behind it. So normally he puts together ingenious combinations of commentaries and rabbinic statements, and it's a magnificent structure, and everyone just stands there with an open mouth. Wow, it's unbelievable. And then one day he's trying to prepare his lecture and nothing comes together. Like nothing makes sense, nothing fits. All the loose ends remain loose. It's a failure. So he's going to come in today. Today his lecture is not going to be very dazzling. People are not going to be astounded. It's just going to be just okay. If you're learning Torah Shaloi Lishma, then it's a disappointment. If you're learning Torah Lishma, you're learning it for its own sake, so wherever it leads you. If it leads you in a way which appears to be particularly insightful, fine, that's the way it is. If you live in a way where things don't come together, then that's the way it is. But it's valuable in its own sake. I pointed out that people make the mistake and they think that learning Torah Lishma is a level which perhaps only the greatest tzaddikim achieve. But everyone else has a hidden agenda, an ulterior motive. I think it's not true. Let's say we'll talk about present company. You've all had a long day, whatever you're doing, whether it's work, taking care of your families, and you manage to get yourself out of the house, come to a class at 9 o'clock p.m. Why? Are you getting paid? I mean, I don't know, maybe Rabbi Rothman is pushing up on the end of the table. I don't know. But I don't think so. Is it honor? Are you being honored? People are going to claim you for your attendance? I think that also. Because why? Because you're coming because you value learning Torah. That's Lishma. If it's not a means to an end, if you're studying Torah because you value Torah, that's Torah Lishma. So even if you don't think of yourselves as being among the great tzaddikim, but the reality is you're learning your Torah is Lishma. If anything, the greatest temptation to learn Torah Shelo Lishma is on the part of the people who teach Torah, especially people who teach it for a profession. They have to teach. They have to be prepared. They have to... Otherwise they don't get paid. So here there's a tremendous temptation to do a Shelo Lishma, do it not for its own sake. But the people who are the good Jews who come to study Torah, they're doing it Lishma for its own sake. Yes?
But if it's enjoyment of intellectual pursuit of Torah, if you enjoy what you see, it's exciting. Learning is exciting.
Okay, let me talk about this. This was a subject that was discussed in a very, very famous work. There's a sefer called Eglei Tal. The Eglei Tal was a sefer on the laws of Shabbos that was written by a great Chassidish Rebbe, the Eliezer of Sachetshav. And in introduction to this book, Eglei Tal, he deals with this objection. That some people say that if you enjoy learning, that itself should make it Shelo Lishma. In other words, if you're learning something which you find tedious, and nevertheless you stick with it, that's a sign that it's Lishma. You're doing it for its own sake because you value it. But if you do it and you enjoy it, so doesn't that make it Shelo Lishma? Isn't that already an ulterior motive? You're doing it for pleasure. Now the Eliezer gives an answer which frankly I don't understand. I think that the Eliezer's answer is based on a different understanding of Lishma than I have. I'll tell you what his answer is, and I'll tell you why I think that he had a different understanding of the concept of Lishma. He says that the joy of study does not detract from the quality of study, because that is what God wants. God wants that you should enjoy the Torah. Now the question is, very good, God wants that I should enjoy the Torah. But how does that have bearing on this question? But if I do enjoy the Torah, doesn't that minimize the element of Lishma, doing it for its own sake? See, I think the Eliezer had a different conception of Lishma. I think the Eliezer understood Lishma means you do it to fulfill God's will. Learning Torah Lishma means you do it to fulfill the divine command. That's what it means to do it Lishma. So he says, if the divine command was simply to study, then maybe the pleasure you have in the study would detract from the Lishma. You're not doing it for the sake of the divine command alone. You're doing it for your own personal pleasure. But since this is part of what God wants, God doesn't want you should study Torah in a dull way. God wants you should enjoy the Torah, so therefore learning the Torah for the pleasure is really doing God's will. I think that's how we understood it. But again, I think that the word Lishma doesn't mean that. Lishma doesn't mean doing it for the sake of God's will. Lishma means because it has intrinsic value. But I think your question is also answered. what is the pleasure of learning? Because I think you're right. If the pleasure I get out of learning is simply the pleasure that comes from tackling a knotty intellectual problem. In other words, there are people who enjoy doing puzzles. You ever do any Sudoku? Those puzzles? You know, a very interesting story that there was a certain Rosh Yeshiva who smoked for many years. He smoked for many years. Then the Surgeon General of the United States issued his report that it was dangerous. He stopped immediately. But nevertheless, he had smoked many years before that. So he said that when I was a yeshiva bacher in Europe, my roommate taught me how to smoke. And I'll never forgive him. Because what he did to me, he introduced me to a habit which is dangerous, suicidal. So I have to say about puzzles, I like puzzles. But Sudoku, I never could figure out what it was until my dentist introduced me to it. One day I was having a filling, and between the Novocaine, while they're waiting for it to freeze, so there are a few minutes. So he said, "You ever see one of these?" He gave me a quick lesson how to do it, and that's it. Finished. I'll never forgive him for that. But the point is, the people enjoy puzzles. And what difference does it make whether it's a crossword puzzle, a Sudoku puzzle, a Talmudic puzzle? It's an intellectual challenge. You enjoy puzzles. You're right. If a person enjoys it in that sense, then maybe it's already shelo lishma. But I think there's another joy of learning. There's another joy of learning because we all feel good when we are engaged in an activity which has genuine value. When we are doing something with our lives which is truly meaningful, which is truly important, we feel good about ourselves. We feel that we're not wasting our lives. We're devoting our lives to something which is purposeful. That pleasure is bound with the idea of lishma. Because you value Torah in and of itself, it gives you a good feeling to learn Torah because you're doing something which is intrinsically valuable. So that pleasure doesn't take away the lishma. That pleasure, that type of pleasure, is really an indicator of the fact of doing a lishma. The fact of doing a lishma, because you value it in and of itself, gives you that gratification that you're devoting your life to something purposeful. Yes?
Well, it's really, isn't it really hard to tease apart the different motivations? Like if something is really, really boring, it's impossible to really get a geschmack from it. You know?
No, you see, I don't,
satisfaction.
I don't look at it that way. Maybe I'm weird, but I'll tell you like this. Yes, there are times that learning is not as enjoyable as other times. But I find, at least in my own experience, the times that the learning is not enjoyable is when I don't devote enough time or enough energy to truly understand what I'm learning. So I feel I've only done a superficial job, and therefore I'm not happy, I'm frustrated, I'm disappointed in myself. That's why I find it uninteresting. But where I'm able to motivate myself and allow the time to study it carefully, word by word, painstakingly, then to me it seems that it's always pleasurable. It's always pleasurable to learn something. But even if it's something which is not so difficult, not so challenging, it's something new, something valuable. That's a joy. It's a joy to devote yourself to it, some type of task. That's what it seems to me. I don't think there's anything that's really boring.
Is it possible to develop that kind of feeling later in life? If you were born into that lifestyle, you were born into that, you went to yeshiva as a young child?
Well, no one's born into that lifestyle. I mean, when I was 5 years old, I probably didn't think this way. It comes with time.
True, but 5 years old is not 50 years old or even 40 years old.
No. I think that it's not. I think it's true for everybody. I think it's just we rarely give ourselves the opportunity to really learn in a way that will give us satisfaction. Because we have to do things. Because if we give ourselves 5 minutes to do an act which requires an hour, so we're going to walk away with a sense that we really didn't cover it, we really didn't delve into it, really didn't understand it, we really didn't master it. There's a lot which is vague. So naturally it'll be a frustrating, disappointing experience. When we give ourselves the time and the attention, and that's by the way a big challenge, because sometimes we don't have that kind of time, type of attention. Then it is enjoyable. Sometimes it's just a very, very small thing. If you learn it well, it becomes a genuine possession, something that you really will cherish. It doesn't have to be intricate, complicated. We have a very, very straightforward, simple idea. But you've studied it, you've mastered it, you've grasped it, you've absorbed it. That's a great pleasure. I think so. Now, it says here that the person who learns Torah Lishma for its own sake, so the entire creation of the world was worthwhile for him. Now, I think it's going to sound like this. The Mishnah says that there are 3 pillars on which the world stands. In the beginning of Breitowitz: Torah, Avoda, and Gemilus Chasadim. What does it mean the world stands on these 3 pillars? It means these 3 justify creation. These 3 justify creation. Meaning, that's why God created the world. God created the world because there would be Torah study in the world. He created the world because there would be avoda in the world. There would be gemilas chasadim in the world. And that means like this. See, there are many things that are valuable, but they're only valuable once there already is a world. For example, good health. Good health is valuable. Having money is valuable. But if you were God sitting on your throne contemplating, should I create the world or not? So would this argument make sense? I'm going to create the world because I foresee that in the world I create there will be good health. Or I will create the world because I foresee that in the world I create people will have money. Once there is a world, certainly it's better to have money, it's better to be in good health. But that certainly wouldn't justify creating the world. It wouldn't make sense for God to make that type of argument. But when God sits on his throne and says, I'm going to create the world because there's going to be Torah in the world, that's what the Mishnah is saying, that Torah is so valuable that God said that there should be Torah study in the world. That justifies creation. That there should be avodas Hashem, there should be gemilas chasad. Now, one important thing you have to know is that even though there are 3 pillars, the Chaim of Eliezer points out, ultimately, they all rest on the single pillar of Torah. The 3 pillars rest on the 1 pillar of Torah. Because it is the pillar of Torah which defines the other 2. What is considered a legitimate form of avodas Hashem? That which the Torah defines as avodas Hashem. What is considered a legitimate form of gemilas chasadim? That which the Torah defines as gemilas chasadim. For example, let's say a person would decide to offer a sacrifice in his backyard tonight. He'll take an animal, make a little altar in his backyard, slaughter the animal. You think, animal sacrifice. The Torah is filled with animal sacrifice. It's a beautiful thing. But the halacha is that once the Beis Hamikdash was built, you're not allowed to perform animal sacrifice outside of the temple. If you do so, you're liable to the terrible punishment of kares. So that's not a legitimate form of avodas Hashem. I might have thought differently, but the Torah defines what is a valid form of avodah. Bringing an animal sacrifice today outside of the temple is not a legitimate form of avodah. Let's say gemilas chasad. Let's say a person will lend you money, a large amount of money, at below market rates. The banks are charging, let's say, 4%, and this person says, I'll lend you $100,000 at 2%. Tremendous chesed, tremendous kindness. The interest is cut in half. Yet the Torah tells us that lending money on interest, any interest, even below the market rate, is not a legitimate form of Gemilas Chasadim. It's a terrible aveira. The Torah says that you're not allowed to charge interest. You're not allowed to collect interest. You're not even allowed to pay interest. It's a prohibition in the Torah. The borrower is not allowed to pay the interest even. He violates the biblical command. And it's a terrible crime. The Talmud says that if a person lends money and interest, he doesn't rise at the time of the resurrection. He isn't come with Chiyas Mesa. Reminds me of a very, very cute story that is told about Rabbi Akiva Eger. Akiva Eger was a Rav in a city, and in this city there was a very, very wealthy man who had two strikes against him. First of all, he was very, very stingy. He never gave any money to charity. Number two, his livelihood, his source of wealth, was that he was a loan shark. He charged interest on loans that he made. But when he died, so the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society that was in charge of all the arrangements, figured this is our golden opportunity to squeeze the estate for some charity money. So they decided that they would charge his family double for the burial plot. If everyone paid 1,000 coins, he'd have to pay 2,000 coins. And the extra proceeds would go to charity, and this would be the opportunity to finally get some money out of him. So the children came, and they're making the arrangements, and the Chevra Kadisha says that for you the cost is double. It's not fair. Everyone else pays 1,000 coins. Why should we have to pay 2,000 coins? It's not fair. So they argue back and forth. The case finally goes to the rabbi of the city, the Rav of the city, Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva says that it's fair. It's fair that your father should have to pay double. Why is it fair? So he says like this: says normally when you buy a burial plot, you only need it for temporary use. Because when the Chiyas Mason comes, when the resurrection comes, you don't need it anymore. You buy it out of the grave. But if a person lends money and charges interest, he doesn't rise to the Chiyas Mason. So he needs a burial plot for permanent use. Well, it makes sense. You have to pay double. That's the apocryphal story that's told. It illustrates this point that if we're talking about Gemilas Chasadim, kindness this is not a legitimate form of kindness. So it's Torah which defines Gemilas Chasadim, and it defines Avodah. So although there are three pillars, but ultimately they all rest on the same pillar, which is the pillar of Torah. The person who engages in Torah thus is engaged in that activity for which the world was created. This is to a greater extent than even Avodah and Gemilas Chasadim, because Torah is the central pillar. And therefore that's what the Mishnah says, that such a person, it was worthwhile to create a world for him, because that's what the world was created for the person who studies Torah Lishma. Yes?
But is that enough for that person? Doesn't that person also have to practice the other two in order to be complete?
Of course you have to do. So a person has to do the mitzvahs. But there are many things a person has to do.
But if he learns,
right?
He just learns and doesn't put those two things into practice.
That's not appropriate. A person has to put his learning into practice. He has to observe the mitzvahs. But the question is, what activity is the most important? That's his study of Torah. Is being engaged in Torah. That's what the Mishnah says. Now let's see some of the things it says about this person. Nikra Reya, he is called a friend of God, Ohuv, beloved to God. Now we know that these are two different levels. A person is a friend, and a person is beloved. It's a much more intimate relationship. For example, the Torah says, "V'yohavta l'reacha kamocha." You should love your reya. You should love your friend. That means he's already your friend. The Torah is telling us you should take the relationship to a higher level, not just you should be friendly to your friend, you should love your friend. In this context, what does a friend mean? A friend means a fellow Jew. Because a reya means a person with whom you have something in common. There's a friendship, there's a collegiality, because you have something in common. With every Jew, we have things in common. We share a common Torah, we share the obligation to perform mitzvahs, we share a common interest in the faith of the Jewish people. So therefore, every Jew is a reya. Every Jew is a friend to every other Jew. But the fact you have friends doesn't mean you love them necessarily. You can have friends who are acquaintances, people you know, people you invite to your simchas. But you're not particularly upset if they don't come. You know, he's a friend. He's a friend. He's a colleague. The Torah says that that's not enough. You have to love every person who is a fellow Jew, every person who is a friend, a colleague. In that sense, you have to love him. Love him means that you really, really care for him. That's v'ahavta l'reach. This is we're mentioning. I'll just tell you. What does it mean kamocha? You love the friend like you love yourself. What does that mean? So we're talking about, and since the pasuk came up, I'll explain. The Ramban says it does not mean what people think it means. That you should love your friend as much as you love yourself. That's not what it means. Because that's impossible. You can't love your friend as much as you love yourself. Obviously, every person is to himself the most precious thing. It means you should love your friend in the same way that you love yourself. Meaning the same things you want for yourself, you should seek for your friend. And this is one of those things which is so often neglected. Because for ourselves, what do we want? We want to be materially comfortable, financially successful, etc., etc., etc. What do I want for my friend? That he should learn Torah, he should do mitzvahs, the type of thing. And that's the mistake. Whereas you should want for your friend the same things you want for yourself. You want for yourself that you should have a job, and you should have a roof over your head, and you should have clothing to wear. That's what you should want for your friend. And you should make sure that he has it. Needless to say, if you value spiritual things and you want to be a Torah scholar yourself, then of course it is appropriate. You should make sure that your friend has the same opportunity. But it really means not that you love your friend as much as you love yourself, that's impossible, but you love your friend in the same way that you love yourself. But loving your friend takes the friendship to a new level. Most people have friends, they have acquaintances, but to say that you love them, in the sense that you make them the object of your deep, deep concern, that usually is not the case. We have a Torah, and we share it with God. And therefore, God would naturally speak of us as being colleagues. We're friends. We have things in common. We have a Torah which we share. That's Ray. Okay? We can be friends. Doesn't mean we're best friends. Doesn't mean we're lovers. No. It's more than that. It's Ohuv. You are God's beloved as well. Not just His acquaintance. Not just His friend. You are His lover. Because God loves you. Why? Because what you share in common is not something which is somewhat important to Him. It's not even something which is very important to Him. It's something which is absolutely of supreme importance to Him. And if that's what you share in common, then the relationship is elevated to a new level. It's not just that you are associates, but what you share in common is so deep and so essential and so vital that you are you become beloved to Him. You become the object of His ultimate concern. Now, that's from God's perspective. God calls us His friends and His beloved. But it goes the other way too. Ohei v'es-hamakai, ohei v'es-abriyas. A person who studies Torah Lishma loves God, and he loves humanity as well. Now, that he loves God, I understand. Certainly, if you study Torah and you appreciate Torah, you're going to love the God who gave it to you. In what sense does he love people? Does he love people? You should know that the person who studies Torah Lishma is doing great things for mankind. There's a Gemara which says in Perek Keilah that Ezel Apikairis, what is an example of a person who is considered a heretic? The Gemara answers a person who says, Mayahanu lan Rabban, what benefit do we have from the rabbis? The two karu, the two tanu, they learn for themselves, they study for themselves, we have no benefit from them. What do we have? We have no benefit from them. So the Gemara says that's a heretic. And the Gemara goes on to say that not only is that person guilty of a heresy, the person has overlooked an explicit verse in the Torah. It says that when Avraham Avinu prayed to God to spare the city of stone, he got God to relent, and God agreed that if there are a number of righteous people in the city, I will save the entire city for their sake. That means if there are 50 or 45 or 40 or 30 or 20 or 10 tzaddikim in the city, they can save the entire city. So how can you say what benefits we have from the rabbis? What benefits we have from the rabbis? So it's their merit that sustains the entire city. Now, I understand when you're doing PR for a yeshiva, this is a hard sell. I remember once hearing Rabbi Waxman speaking at a convention where he pointed out that the Lakewood Yeshiva put out a brochure about what their graduates are doing in the Jewish community. And they write, we have this many rabbis who came out, and this many educators, and this many administrators, and this many Hasidic Rebbes. They put out Rebbes too. Not they learn how to be Rebbes in Lakewood, but it happens to be that even Rebbes were students once upon a time, so they may have spent time in Lakewood. So Lakewood, the yeshiva graduates Rebbes too. So Rabbi Axon pointed out that it could be for fundraising. That's what you have to do. You have to convince people that the yeshiva provides a community service, or else people won't open their wallets, okay, checkbooks. I understand that. But we have to know that the reality is that young scholar who's sitting in a corner of the Beis Medrash, learning with great passion and great devotion and great hasmoda, great diligence, is providing a service to the world which is unimaginable. Maybe his merit sustains the entire world. Maybe he's one of those tzaddikim that is providing the merit which spares all of us. I lived in California for many years, and California was a wicked place. And there were parts of it that were especially wicked. That there were cities in California where it was hard to imagine that stone could have been worse. Hard to imagine. I mean, anything could be worse, but it's so degenerate. It's hard to imagine stone was worse. And yet California didn't fall off into the Pacific Ocean. You wonder why. Maybe it's because there were 50 tzaddikim or 40 tzaddikim or 10 tzaddikim. In California, we're learning Torah. They spared the entire city. So a person who learns Torah Lishma is not only doing something which is of interest and concern to God, he is doing something which is of great interest and concern for all mankind. He is doing something good for them. And therefore he is a person who loves God and a person who loves humanity, and more than that. He makes God happy and he makes people happy. Now, a student once asked me, in what sense do you make people happy? I mean, who knows? Who knows? What about the people who don't approve of people learning Torah? Mistakenly, of course. Are they happy? So I explained, when the Mishnah says that the person who learns Torah L'Shma makes people happy, it doesn't mean he makes people happy in a way that they realize he's the one who's making them happy. You're sitting at home and you're enjoying your life, your home, and your family, and your amusements, and maybe you'd have none of that if not for that person who was learning the Shema and prevented your city from being destroyed. So therefore, to the extent that anyone has joy and pleasure in life, it's really a credit to the person who has Torah L'Shma. Now it says, Umal Bashto Anava V'yira. The learning Torah L'Shma clothes a person with humility and fear of God. Now, we have to know about fear of God. There are two types of fear of God. There is what's called Yiras HaEinash, fear of punishment, which is doing nothing more than enlightened self-interest. Because God is very powerful. God punishes us when He disapproves of what we're doing. So therefore, we have to behave. That's called Yiras HaEinash. Then there's Yiras HaRemumus. Yiras HaRemumus is when we stand in awe of God's majesty. We stand in awe of God's majesty. We realize we are in the presence of greatness. There's something which is just magnificent. and our mouths drop open in awe. That's called Yiras HaRemus. Now, Yiras HaRemus can come from many things. The Rabbi writes in the Mishnah Torah that we can acquire Yiras HaRemus when we contemplate, number one, God's creation, and number two, God's management of history. When we contemplate the creation, when we see the wonders of the cosmos, we just stand in awe of Him. If you reflect on the vastness of the universe, you feel that what am I? And once upon a time, people had a concept of Earth and man being at the center of the universe, before Copernicus. And this is the impression that some people got from the Bible. When Copernicus sparked his revolution, which showed that really the sun is the center of the system, which is now called the solar system, and the Earth is at the periphery. So many people thought that this is a anti-religious position. It's contrary to the Bible. No, it's contrary to the Bible. It's contrary to the whole idea of religion, which places man at the center. To me, it seems a little bizarre. Maybe it goes against the superficial translation of certain biblical verses, but to me it seems that it's a much more religious idea. In other words, if the idea of religion is to stand with a sense of wonder in the presence of God, so there's a much bigger sense of awe when we truly see ourselves as a speck at the periphery than when we see ourselves as the center of all things. So if anything, the Copernican view of the universe, and as it's been expanded and developed, the sheer vastness fills us with a sense of our own insignificance and a sense of God's overwhelming majesty. He's the master and creator of this all. And that's when you contemplate the entire universe. But you can contemplate specific things in the universe and you stand in awe. I remember I was going to say the first time, but really the one time I was in Yosemite National Park. It was the first year that we were married. And our first summer we decided we're living in California, we'll go to Yosemite. We had no children, get in the car, went to Yosemite. We arrived there at night. We parked, we had a cabin, very nice. We woke up the next morning and we saw these cliffs that are just 1,500 feet high, sheer cliffs. And you stand in awe, you're going to struggle. That's Yiras HaRemus. So that's what Rambam says. That if you study creation, and by the way, you can study a single body cell, and you think of the biochemical cycles that are necessary to keep that one cell going, it staggers the mind. So that's one way. You reflect on God's creations. If you reflect on God's running the world, you also can stand in the law of God, but here, of course, it requires a lot more insight. Because to be able to see the patterns, to see how everything falls into place, sometimes is easier said than done. But if a person studies history from a proper perspective and sees how justice ultimately is done and everything that's meant to happen does happen, says the Rambam, that also will lead a person to a sense of God's hashgacha. Now I teach a class in American history, and yesterday we were discussing Lincoln's second inaugural address. And in his inaugural address, he makes the following point, that when the Civil War began, neither side anticipated that it would result in the end of slavery. The war really was over a much narrower issue. That the South wanted to extend slavery into the territories. The North wanted to limit slavery to the states where it already existed. And the South was willing to break away from the Union to get its way. The North wanted to preserve the Union, and that was the issue over which the Civil War was fought. But as Lincoln pointed out, that as things unfolded, it ended up not that way. By the time that Lincoln gave his second inaugural address in March of 1865, just a month before he was assassinated, by that time the slaves had been liberated, and it was clear that there were designs that were not planned by the human beings involved. And essentially, I won't cite his words, but he says that this was really God running the course of history. And he brought about the end to the sin of American slavery by allowing this war to take place, where the participants in the war had a totally different agenda. But this was God making the decision that that the sin of American slavery should now be removed, and therefore he guided the events to bring about that end. It's a fantastic, fantastic speech. But people of genuine religious insight, when they study history, they see that there's a God running the world. That's another way that they acquire Yiras Haremus. The third way, the Rambam doesn't mention in the Mishnah Torah. He mentions in the Perush Mishnah that the third way is when you study Torah. When a person studies Torah, if he sees the depths, the profundity of Torah, so he also becomes overwhelmed. It's also a demonstration of God's greatness and majesty. And by the way, I'll just mention that really, when we say the blessings before and after the Shema in the morning, the three blessings, the two that we say before and the one blessing we say after, really relate to these three themes. The first blessing, Yotzer Over Rechoshech, speaks of God as creator. The second blessing, Avarabba, speaks of God as giver of the Torah. And the blessing that follows, the bracha of Yatziv, speaks of God as he who manages the course of history, specifically with regards to the liberation from Egypt. And therefore, surrounding the Shema, which is the confession of our faith, we talk about the ways in which we come to know and come to revere God. So that's what we're saying over here, that when a person learns Torah Lishma, it clothes him with humility, because he stands in awe of God when he has an inkling of God's greatness that emerges from the Torah that he studies, the Yira, and he becomes clothed with Yira. If a person is both humble and reverent, then it prepares him for all other wonderful virtues. It prepares him to be a tzaddik, to be a righteous person, a chassid, a scrupulously pious person, Yashar, a scrupulously honest person, the Neman, and a trustworthy person. It distances him from sin, and brings him to merit. So these are all things that come from a person who learns Torah Lishma. So there's so many fringe benefits. It's a wonderful thing that all of you do it regularly, and you may not realize that you're reaping the benefits. But this is what learning Torah Lishma does for a person.
There's no minimum amount that you have to
The more the better. The more the better. Do you want to be a big tzaddik or a little tzaddik? That's the question. I think most of us want to be a big tzaddik, so do more. Can't hurt. Okay, everyone. So have a great week.